Heavy police presence has protected a statue of Captain James Cook in Sydney's Hyde Park as colonial monuments are toppled and vandalised around the world. Officers were seen circling the statue during last night's unauthorised Black Lives Matter protest. It remained under guard until after demonstrators had dispersed.
Captain James Cook, is he really the poster boy of racist British colonialism? Or has he unfairly become the scapegoat for a society trying to redress the crimes of its past? Who was James Cook? What were his personal feelings and motivations? And does he deserve to disappear from history?
Soundings in the channel of old England, from Hush and from sailing to city for the first land we made was a point called the Dead Man. Next Ramshead off Plymouth, Stark, Portland and White. We sailed then by Beachy, by Fairley and Dungeness, and bore straight away for the south, for the sight, for the right, and we'll roar like true British sailors, we'll rat.
2020 marked the 250th anniversary of Cook's epic first voyage, which now sees him become the centre of controversy between those who venerate his legacy as one of the greatest navigators, cartographers and explorers in history, and those who view him as the source and symbol of all Indigenous misery in Australia and the Pacific. Despite the myths, few have ever penetrated behind the veneer of this unassuming and very private man. In this video, we'll try to get to know the man behind the legend and hopefully untangle the myths from the truth to better understand his enormous role in history as well as his lasting legacy. As First Nations people demand the rewriting of history to account for the genocide and exploitation of their ancestors, it's only natural that the prime figures of European colonialism come under scrutiny. Of the countless historical statues of European men they see all around them, one seems to be far more common in far more places than all the others. His substantial veneration by British and other Anglo-centric governments around the world only serves to mark him out for special abuse by people who naturally see him as the preeminent reminder of colonialism. It's been said that there are no extraordinary men, only ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. It's likewise said that some men seek greatness while others have greatness thrust upon them. At the heart of these aphorisms is the understanding that, to a degree, our place in history and the legacy we leave behind is subject to the whims of chance and change, not only the result of our own endeavours, or, for that matter, best intentions. To be remembered is one thing. To be remembered fondly is quite something else. Worse still is to be forgotten. But worst of all is to be cancelled, to have your life and legacy smeared and falsely remembered as a villain. For kings and conquerors, this is a fate that is always on the cards. From Stalin to Hussein to Robert E. Lee, the 21st century has revived statue toppling with gusto. But the tearing down of statues is nothing new. Even the ancient Egyptians and Romans would strike out the faces and names of overturned rulers to sentence them to the infinite hell of being forgotten, in a practice known as damnatio memoriae. James Cook was, without doubt, one of the most extraordinary explorers in history, of whom it's been said that he personally charted, with an astonishing degree of accuracy, a third of the entire world, most of which was, at the time, unknown. And having circumnavigated the entire globe 3 times, discovered more places than any single explorer in history. But his was as unlikely a story as you could possibly imagine. The little Yorkshire village of Marton in the north of England has little to recommend it, besides a 12th century church and the distinction of once having been owned by the family of Scottish patriot Robert the Bruce. By the 1700s, it was one of the poorest regions of Britain, and people were leaving in droves to stave off destitution. James Cook Sr., an immigrant Scotsman, worked as a farmhand and labourer wherever he could find odd jobs, while his locally born wife Grace made a home for them and their young family in a squalid mud cottage where their son James Jr., the second of 8 children, was born on November the 7th, 1728. By young James's 6th birthday, his father was offered a permanent job as a farmhand on Sir Thomas Scotto's farming estate in Great Ayton, 6 miles away, and, like many others, the Cooks packed up their meagre belongings and headed for greener pastures. Lord of the manor, Thomas Scotto, was a progressive landholder and took a personal interest in the welfare of his tenants. Impressed by James Sr.'s farm knowledge, he was soon promoted to lead hand, while the young James showed such an aptitude, good behaviour, and keenness of observation that the progressive Lord Scotto himself encouraged the lad to go to school, paying for his tuition and, when he turned 16, even arranging for him to serve an apprenticeship with grocer and haberdasher William Sanderson in the fishing village of Stathes, a few miles away on the English coast. Life as a shop boy was demanding and lonely, as young James was required to open, serve customers, do stock takes, fill orders, and close up for the evenings more or less on his own. His boss, Mr. Sanderson, was demanding and firm, with James dining frugally and alone in the shop at night. Afterwards, sleeping on the floor behind the counter, while Sanderson and his family lived upstairs, affording him little social contact outside of work obligations. It made for a lonely and harsh adolescence, so during breaks, James often found himself wandering down to the dock to watch the fishermen and collier ship workers load up and sail away. He eventually made a number of friends among the old sailors who told stories of treacherous seas and daring adventures, such that he began to fantasize about leaving his dull and lonely shopkeeper's life and becoming a merchant seaman. Within 18 months, James had had enough and begged to be released from his apprenticeship. Sanderson, a hard but pragmatic man, relented and introduced him to his friends John and Henry Walker, who owned a local coal shipping company out of Whitby, 20 miles away. The Walkers, like many in Whitby, were hard-working, clean-living Quaker Christians, and had had a successful business supplying coal and timber to London via the locally custom-built collier ships known as Whitby Cats, flat-bottomed sailing vessels that were extremely sturdy, could handle running aground over the many sandy English shoals, and had a huge storage capacity for coal and timber. John Walker took a liking to young James and took him on as an apprentice seaman. Mrs. Walker insisted that a bedroom be made for him in the loft, where James could comfortably sleep as well as study, and she also insisted that he eat with them as part of their family. Mr. Walker enrolled James at the local merchant navy school, where he was to study algebra, geometry, trigonometry, navigation and astronomy to qualify him for service in the merchant navy. He took to his studies with serious determination and excelled at applying his knowledge while at sea to their regular trips to London. The Walkers would note that James had a remarkable capacity to remain focused on a task for extraordinary lengths of time and was an exceptionally fast learner while on the job. Unlike many other layabout youths, he was constantly pestering the Walkers to teach him everything they could, absorbing their knowledge enthusiastically like a sponge. Now, it's worth taking a moment to understand a little more about the Quaker sect, because the Walkers were part of a very religious community whose kindness, support and generosity had a massive impact on James' worldview, as well as his personal principles and work ethic. Much of his future behaviour can be seen through the influence of the Quakers, even though James was not himself a particularly religious man. The Quakers, or more formally known as the Religious Society of Friends, were a fundamentalist Protestant Christian sect that evolved out of the many dissenting religious communities at the close of the English Civil War, which lasted from about 1642 to 1651. Dissatisfied with what they saw as endemic corruption within the established church, as well as its symbiotic relationship with the ruling classes, these various dissenters called for a return to the simple preaching of the gospel, a rejection of all symbology and a dismantling of all religious hierarchy. They believed that bishops, priests, and even the sacraments were unnecessary, and in particular, they believed that direct communion with Jesus was entirely possible without the intercession of an ordained clergy. They met together in meetings rather than mass, without ministers or priests, and members would only speak as they felt inspired to do so. Given their belief in a direct personal experience of Jesus, they emphasised a constant state of awareness of being that would always be receptive to an unexpected divine revelation at any moment. Consequently, they spoke plainly, infrequently, dressed simply, and furnished their homes without ostentation, believing that their daily actions and behaviour were a direct expression of their faith and religiosity. This is why they never used vulgar language. They had a tireless work ethic and made voluntary aid the centre of their community spirit. They refused to swear oaths, as to do so implied that in other circumstances they may not have been telling the truth. So popular was their simple, grassroots appeal to ordinary people that throughout the 1700s their numbers grew exponentially, particularly in poor rural areas. Ultimately, this movement was far too confronting to the existing power structure, and so laws were passed persecuting them for some time, with many Quakers ending up on the gallows or burned at the stake for heresy. Quakers, like their contemporaries the Puritans, ended up fleeing to the New World, setting up colonies all over America, in order to avoid persecution from the authorities back home. Quaker women enjoyed far greater social equality as well as family authority than other women in England, particularly in the raising of children and as a voice in their communities. The Quaker belief in God's divine spark within each human being caused them to be outspoken opponents of slavery as well as racial vilification of any kind, being the chief instigators of the abolitionist movement in both England and the American colonies. It also sparked their legendary pacifist stance and opposition to capital punishment, something that was stunningly controversial even up to our own times. Their moderation with alcohol, aversion to drugs, smoking, gambling and prostitution, along with their Herculean Protestant work ethic, made them often quite wealthy compared to their many wastrel contemporaries, and they're credited as forming the primary business ventures that precipitated the Industrial Revolution in England. Quaker philanthropic work revolved around the relief of poverty, the building of hospitals, schools, and the forming of mutual life insurance companies, as well as savings and investment banks that aimed to protect vulnerable people from destitution. More contemporary Quakers have given rise to well-known organisations such as Amnesty International, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, the charity Oxfam, and even Greenpeace. So, with that background in mind, young James Cook differed from most other promiscuous and raucous men of the 1700s by staying away from taverns, gambling dens and brothels while on shore, and remaining sober while at sea, instead immersing himself in his studies, keen to make solid progress as a sailor. By the age of 21, James had completed his final examinations and qualified as an able seaman. He now undertook more extensive voyages along the Baltic coast as well as to the Dutch coast, and with further study and an unblemished record over 16 long-range journeys, was, by the age of 24, promoted to first mate. By 1755, his dedication and skill saw him at the tender age of just 27 being offered command of his very own vessel, but James Cook's dream of travel to the exotic lands of the Pacific exceeded even this significant achievement. The drums of war were beating, and James noticed increased Royal Navy activity in London. Just before the outbreak of the 7 Years' War with France, he made the fateful decision to turn down a merchant navy captaincy to enlist instead in the Royal Navy, despite the significant demotion in rank that would accompany that. He nevertheless believed his future lay in the Royal Navy, where the spoils of war could make a man exceedingly rich. His industriousness and dedication were soon noticed by Captain Joseph Hamar, as Cook stood in total contrast to the toothless, drunken rabble of press-ganged landlubbers that the Admiralty had assigned to his command on the HMS Eagle, a 58-gun fourth-rate ship of the line. Competent sailors were a rare commodity, and within a short time, Cook was promoted to master's mate, well on his way to a warrant and hopefully the rank of master, the highest achievement generally possible for non-gentlemen. Now, the Royal Navy, because of the highly specialised skills and experience needed to sail a man of war, was generally more open to meritocratic advancement than the Army, but the strict social order meant that it would be nigh on impossible for a peasant, no matter how talented, to become a captain or other senior officer in His Majesty's Navy. It would border on scandal for gentlemen officers, who were generally commissioned as midshipmen, to be barked orders by a non-gentleman captain positioned on a deck above them. These minor officers often knew very little about seafaring and relied heavily on the able seaman, a foremast, to execute tasks parroted down the line by the captain and his senior officers. The best a low-born man could hope for would be to become a warrant officer, usually a master, who, for all intents and purposes, was the most experienced and skilled man on board, who ran the entire ship, navigation, logbooks, supply, crew management, and even the gunnery on behalf of the captain, whose position was generally reserved for a wealthy and influential nobleman. If you were lucky, your captain was a career naval commander, experienced, appreciative and concerned about the welfare of his ship and crew. If not, he was merely a cashed up but clueless upper-class twit, financing the ship with his own money and purely out for personal glory, exploiting his ship and his crew to the maximum, often to the point of disaster. Fortunately for Cook, Hamar and his eventual replacement aboard the Eagle, Captain Palliser, both recognised his conscientiousness and potential, with Palliser, a fellow Yorkshireman, becoming especially fond of Cook and making extra time to tutor him on the complexities and demands of oceanic voyages, weather and wave patterns, as well as sounding and the taking of bearings, at a time when the calculation of longitude was still an elusive problem to be solved. As they prowled the waters off England's south coast, the Eagle engaged the French frigate Esperance off the coast of Biscay in November of 1755, and in Cook's first naval engagement they gave the enemy ship such a pounding that it went up in flames, whereupon Palliser, unusual for his humane treatment of the enemy, ordered the Eagle's lifeboats out to rescue the French survivors. Soon afterward, they came across a more sturdy adversary, the 50-gun Duc d'Aquitaine, and in a brilliant series of manoeuvres, Palliser captured the vessel and ordered Cook to sail her back to Britain, where he collected his share of the bounty, over half his annual wage in prize money. By October 1757, just shy of his 29th birthday, Cook received his first warrant, being promoted to master, and transferred to HMS Pembroke, a shiny new 60-gunner. In barely 10 years, James Cook, the labourer's son from a hick village in Yorkshire, had gone from a wet behind-the-ears apprentice on a grubby collier to the highest Royal Navy rank a non-gentleman can aspire to. His new commander was the progressive and ambitious Captain John Simcoe, father of the man who, as governor, would unilaterally abolish slavery in the Canadian territories, well ahead of his mother country of Great Britain, or for that matter any other European power. The Pembroke was to join an invasion fleet that was forming at Halifax on the Newfoundland frontier, with the intention of blockading the St. Lawrence River and taking the strategic French fortress of Louisbourg at its mouth. The ultimate goal was to continue upriver and take Quebec from the French, thus securing British rule over the entire coast of Canada. However, the crossing took weeks longer than planned, the ship being battered by storms and raging seas. The exceedingly long crossing and dwindling food quality gave Cook his first glimpse of scurvy, the disease we now know to be due largely to vitamin C deficiency that begins with body aches and pains, skin problems, and eventually gum bleeding, tooth loss, and infections that cause stinking, pus-filled boils that eventually leads to a horrible and painful death. The ship's crew gradually succumbed, sailor by sailor, until numerous deaths and infirmity plagued the crew such that it limped into Halifax harbour with barely enough hands on deck to sail her in. Cook was spared any illness, however, and it got him thinking about his own state of health, abstinence and clean living as possibly playing a role in his resistance to the disease. Their delay at Halifax to treat the sick meant that the fleet had already sailed on and laid siege to the fortress, which seemed impregnable. However, the British managed to land heavy guns on its landward side, and the fleet blockaded its supply from the river. As the months dragged on, the Pembroke eventually joined the blockade, with Cook involved in organising a night raid by 50 rowboats to cut loose and capture 2 French men-of-war guarding its harbour. Seeing all hope of relief and supply cut off, the French commander of the port surrendered just as the winter freeze of the river began to set in. The rest of the invasion was postponed until the spring thaw, as the army and navy now settled in to months of idleness. It was here, in his boredom and looking for something to do, that Cook wandered near the water's edge and came across Dutchman Lieutenant Samuel Holland, an engineer and chief military surveyor under General Wolfe. The French having removed all warning and guide buoys from the river, the British needed to chart a safe passage upstream to continue to prosecute their siege of Quebec when the weather improved. Holland was given the task of finding a safe passage, so he began by making surveys of the local area. Unbelievably, up to this time, most marine maps were still drawn by eye, with only approximate indication of dangerous shoals, reefs, as well as distances. Despite the available technology, the Admiralty was slow to adopt more advanced surveying techniques that had long been used by the Army, leaving the Dutchman without much support or assistance in his current task. Holland was a new breed of engineer who used state-of-the-art plane table and Alidade triangulation gear to precisely map any given area. Cook was astounded to hear that this could even be done from aboard a ship sailing along a coastline. Recognising the potential, he reported back to Captain Simcoe, who, like Cook, saw the supreme value of this technology and what it could provide the Navy in saving countless lives that might otherwise be wrecked upon reefs and shallows not accurately indicated on a chart. He invited Holland to dinner aboard the Pembroke, and the result was that the enthusiastic Cook was given leave to study cartographic trigonometry under Lieutenant Holland. Holland taught Cook everything he knew, and the conscientious young master devoured every scrap of knowledge he could, going out with Holland from dawn to dusk every day, while the rest of the sailors lounged and drank their days away in taverns and brothels on shore. As the months wore on, Cook would row out to take measurements from a boat, devising ways of adapting the plane table to be used on water. Combining this new topographical trigonometry to the plumb line depth sounding already in use, he developed a combined marine and terrestrial cartographic technique which, with the assistance of Holland and Simcoe, resulted in some of the most detailed and accurate coastal maps ever produced. Captain Simcoe by now had developed pneumonia, and as his health slowly faded, he sent off the completed charts to the Admiralty back in England, and urging the Admiralty to adopt his new system of cartography. The winter finally over, in June of 1759, the fleet finally set out for the journey upriver. With the thaw came the need to sound the upper waters of the river in order to avoid the dangerous shoals and submerged rocks that could devastate the fleet. Cook was selected to go ahead with a number of other masters and do the soundings, sometimes under heavy French gunfire, but his resulting charts were eventually distributed to all the captains, and the British made their way safely to lay siege to Quebec. Being at the fore of the fleet, the watch aboard the Pembroke suddenly raised an alarm. The French had set a number of boats and rafts on fire and sent them downriver to torch the vulnerable and compressed British fleet. As master of the Pembroke, Cook ordered a number of boats out to intercept them, and they managed to grapple and tow the offending vessels to a safe distance, saving the fleet from potential disaster. When the time came to finally attack, General Wolfe's first assault on the only obvious beachhead failed miserably. Looking for any possible weakness, he consulted Cook's detailed map anew and spotted a small beach that might do the trick. Sending Cook in to sound and buoy the approach, a new assault force followed him into the cove under the cover of darkness, while a diversion was sent back to the northern beachhead that had previously failed. The ruse being successful, with not one assault boat lost, Quebec fell soon after, and Cook's reputation spread rapidly throughout both the Army and the Navy, earning a bonus reward from the local governor in consideration of his indefatigable industry in making himself master of the pilotage of the River of St. Lawrence. As another winter set in and faded away again, Cook noticed the signs of scurvy and malnutrition appearing in the ship's crew once more, so he now busied himself with studying everything he could on the prevention of scurvy. He began to formulate the idea that fresh food seemed to stave off the disease, and so he went to great lengths to source fresh meat and vegetables, while insisting on his men bathing at least once a day, exercising and washing their clothes and linen, as well as airing their bunks outside at least once a fortnight. Fortunately, his plain speech and common origins endeared him to his crew, and he rarely needed to discipline or force them to comply through the administration of the lash. He was a firm believer in the adage that idleness is the devil's playground, so he constantly employed his men in training, drills and maintenance to deter them from drinking and gambling while on board. By the close of 1762, the ship had returned home, and the 33-year-old James, having visited his folks, was encouraged by them to find himself a wife. Back in London, by chance, he crossed paths with the plain and modest young woman, Elizabeth Batts, who was visiting her parents in town. She fell head over heels for the serious yet dashing naval officer. He was refreshingly down to earth, a man of few words, and quite the strong silent type. As for himself, ever observant as Quakers are taught to be for signs of divine providence, he soon proposed, insisting on a no-fuss, no-frills wedding just days later. For James, it was enough that his wife was virtuous and loyal. he cared neither for cashed-up princesses nor for glamorous social butterflies. No sooner had they been married than he had to leave for Newfoundland once more. The Admiralty had received a request from its governor specifically asking for Cook to be assigned to the charting of the rest of this immense territory. So he departed from his now pregnant wife to be given an entire ship to command for the sole purpose of surveying the Canadian coast. So impressed was the governor with his skill and assiduity that he issued Cook with a hefty daily stipend on top of his naval pay. At the end of the season, he returned home to Elizabeth and their new baby boy, named James, and spent long hours at the Admiralty finishing his charts under the scrutiny of impressed senior staff. This pattern continued for several more seasons, with Cook travelling back and forth, even on one voyage taking careful note of an eclipse, which he wrote up to give to a naval officer back home he knew was interested in such things. Little did James know that this account would end up published in the Tracts of the Royal Society, with Cook's name and his accurate observations coming up for discussion. The excitement led to a proposition to chart the rare transit of Venus across the face of the Sun from a number of separate vantage points across the globe, which would give astronomers enough data to calculate the distance of Venus from the Earth and hence of the Earth to the Sun. Cook was the obvious man for the job, but despite his reputation, he was still just a lowly master. Strings were pulled, deals were done between the Admiralty and the Royal Society, and Cook found himself promoted to First Lieutenant. If it were not for his modest nature, extraordinary skill set and reputation, it would have been a scandal. Tahiti was chosen as the site for the observation, given that it was one of the few places in the Pacific for which the latitude and longitude were known and which would figure in the eventual calculations. Finally, Cook would live out his childhood dream and travel to the Pacific. But the Royal Society, which was footing much of the bill, wanted this to be an epic scientific undertaking. Cook was asked, additionally, to trial a number of dietary changes that were believed to prevent scurvy, such as incorporating sauerkraut and malt used to make a sweet drink called wort. One of the big financiers of the journey was the young and immensely wealthy playboy Joseph Banks, whose passion for cataloguing plants and animals, according to the new system developed by Linnaeus in Switzerland, made him somewhat of an eccentric and as well as an obsessive collector of all things animal, mineral and vegetable. Banks was so obsessed by his passion for collecting and cataloguing that he convinced his mentor, eminent Swedish scientist Dr. Daniel Solander, to accompany him, along with a number of artists and assistants, as well as personal servants, and even his 2 greyhounds. Banks was going to do science in style. There was also a strong belief among some of the geologically inclined members of the Royal Society that there had to be a great southern land somewhere between Tahiti and New Zealand to necessarily balance the other continents upon the globe. They already knew of New Holland, or modern-day Australia, the West Coast and Van Diemen's Land, which had already been charted by the Dutch in the preceding centuries, but this landmass was too far west as far as they were concerned. So after the astronomical observations on Tahiti, Cook was secretly charged with sailing south to try and locate this hypothetical landmass, to investigate if New Zealand was attached to it, and to claim this landmass for Great Britain, along with any other suitably valuable territories they might happen to come across. Now, at this point it needs to be said that the President of the Royal Society, Lord Morton, a prominent philosopher, humanitarian and giant of the intellectual Enlightenment, wrote an open letter to Cook, Banks, Solander and the crew, outlining the principles of the society in a strict code of conduct for them to follow while on the journey. In the letter, Lord Morton charges them to exercise the utmost patience and forbearance with respect to the natives of the several lands where the ship may touch, to check the petulance of the sailors and restrain the wanton use of firearms, to have it still in view that shedding the blood of these people is a crime of the highest order. They are the legal possessors of the several regions they inhabit. No European has a right to occupy any part of their country or settle among them without their voluntary consent. He went on to direct the ship's company to respect the wishes of native populations for privacy, and on every occasion to try and make lasting friendships, noting down the names and customs, as well as giving gifts and respecting the environment of the people they came across. This admonition, along with his Quaker principles, was to characterise the way Cook dealt with both his sailors as well as the natives upon whose land they found themselves. On the 25th of August 1768, His Majesty's bark Endeavour sailed out of Plymouth Harbour with 94 souls, including crew, officers, gentlemen, an astronomer, servants, artists, 12 marines, 2 dogs, and thousands of empty boxes to collect specimens. Cook was overjoyed when he first laid eyes on her, for the Endeavour turned out to be a refurbished and refitted Whitby cat, a ship he knew like the back of his hand and held in much esteem since his apprentice days shifting coal. While slower than more contemporary vessels, it was sturdy, balanced, and had excellent stowage. This, perhaps the first scientific vessel ever commissioned, made its way out of Portsmouth and through the Atlantic Ocean without incident, to resupply in Rio de Janeiro. But to the crew's astonishment, the incredulous Brazilian governor refused to believe that a Royal Navy ship would participate in such a scientific expedition, and despite being an ally of England, impounded the ship, accusing Cook and his company of espionage. Eventually, with Cook's vigorous protests and a diplomatic storm brewing, they were allowed to leave, but were not adequately resupplied, putting pressure on the captain, who by now had a solid policy of procuring fresh fruit and vegetables for his crew at every opportunity. He had also implemented the consumption of sauerkraut and malt that had been proposed as potential cures, and banned the crew from dipping bread into the boiled fat left over in copper cooking pans, which some have now suggested was a cause of gut inflammation and consequently a failure to absorb vitamins, thereby also contributing to scurvy. He also ramped up his hygiene regimen, ensuring significant cleanliness among the grumbling crew, and demanded vinegar be used to clean all common surfaces, in a suspicion that predated the germ theory of disease as well as disinfection by hundreds of years. Dissenting crew members were flogged, so seriously did he view his responsibility for maintaining health aboard the ship. They now made their way through rough seas and south toward the Straits of Magellan and Cape Horn, where they laid anchor in Tierra del Fuego, near a settlement of local natives. In all such encounters to come, Cook was distinctive among commanders for his being in the forefront and on the beach in any encounter with native people. Despite the imminent danger of misunderstanding or hostility, he was desperate to avoid any trigger-happy sailor overreacting and causing a bloodbath. Cook took great pains to initiate gift-giving and trade, always on the lookout for available fresh food and water. The natives, fortunately, were eager to trade, and the ship was resupplied with essentials. Meanwhile, Banks and Solander took every opportunity to explore the local countryside, collecting samples. Banks was so obsessed that he even caused the death of several of his servants in a blizzard when they strayed too far up a mountainside and were forced to spend the night in deep snow. This compulsive straying out of Cook's sphere of protection was to cause the captain many headaches over the next 2 years, as the arrogant Banks consistently behaved as though the expedition was his own private pleasure cruise, never hesitating to put other lives at risk in the pursuit of his own interests. He was, in almost every way, save for his passion for science, the antithesis of Cook, being outspoken, rude and intemperate. They nevertheless rarely quarrelled, as Banks was usually immersed all day in acquiring specimens as well as preserving, describing and cataloguing them, leaving Cook to his own duties. It's been observed that at this time Cook's rank was not actually that of captain, but as mentioned previously, lieutenant. It was, however, customary at the time for a commanding officer of a ship, regardless of his rank, to be referred to as captain while in the discharge of that duty, and so we know him today as Captain Cook rather than Lieutenant Cook. Higher rank was to come much later. By January of 1769, they had successfully sailed past Cape Horn, with Cook charting the violent and treacherous coastline for the benefit of future navigators. And so the months dragged on, as they made their way north toward Tahiti, Cook on one side of the table in the great cabin, working on his new charts, while Banks and Solander were on the other end, pressing plants and cataloguing new specimens. It had been almost 5 months, and not one crew member had so far shown any signs of scurvy. It was an extraordinary and unprecedented outcome. His health strategy and experimental diet seemed to be a success. As the Endeavour finally caught sight of land, the sailors became increasingly excited to find out if tales of lusty and exotic naked Tahitian beauties were true. For his part, Cook posted a notice on the mast reminding the crew of their duty and warning them on pain of death not to cause trouble on the island, while he and the science team got busy in preparing a number of observation posts. For their part, the Tahitians treated the visitors generously, holding lavish feasts in their honour and enthusiastically engaging in vigorous trade for everything from iron nails to sex. They were known to drive a hard bargain and were particularly inclined to theft. Their tendency toward deception and stealing was so ingrained that Cook frequently found it exasperating. On one occasion, important scientific equipment went missing, with the usually restrained captain being forced to demand its return by taking a chief hostage at gunpoint. Sure enough, the goods were returned, and he was afterward treated to a conciliatory banquet, only to then have his breeches stolen. Such were the many peculiarities observed among the Polynesians. According to all accounts, the Tahitians led a free love and casual sex lifestyle that would make a hippie nudist commune envious, with Playboy Banks, in particular, developing quite a reputation with the ladies. Cook, for his part, abstained from pleasures of the flesh. He was a devoted family man, and by now, surely a father for the 4th time. He had 2 sons, James and Nathaniel, and a daughter, Elizabeth, with their mother surely delivered of their 4th child by now. While the crew were making the most of this unspoiled paradise, Cook busied himself with preparations for the planetary observation he was sent to perform, turning his thoughts frequently to home, and the young family he rarely got to see. Venus transited across the sun at the expected time, and the observation was duly completed, though for reasons of atmospheric obscurity, the data eventually proved unhelpful to scientists in the long run. In any case, it was time to say goodbye to their Elysian paradise and sail south in search of terra incognita. Of course, Cook was convinced early on that no such landmass was actually there. He had long known what kind of waves, currents, and weather patterns are found in the vicinity of land, so it was no surprise to him that they found nothing. Nobody in the Admiralty ever bothered taking the advice of ordinary sailors. After all, those drunken sods still believed in mermaids. But in matters of practical sailing, particularly in life or death situations, there was often more nautical knowledge to be found in a rowdy Portsmouth pub than in the whole of the British Admiralty. Having duly explored the South Pacific, Cook turned the ship northwest towards New Zealand, which he proceeded to circumnavigate and chart in great detail, establishing with certainty that it was composed of 2 islands and definitely not connected to any other landmass. Supplies running low, they were forced to regularly lay anchor and attempt to trade with local Maoris, who were sometimes violent and sometimes friendly, oscillating between the two, particularly in regions known for its cannibalism. Fortunately, he had on board an exiled Tahitian priest who managed to smooth over most of their confrontations, often to the point they were greeted by food-laden canoes expecting them and keen to trade. The unpredictable Maori were sometimes difficult to placate, and several violent exchanges have been recorded, with Cook always at the fore, restraining his men, firing only when necessary, and risking his life in trying to negotiate a peaceful resolution. A clash of cultures has always been, and it appears always will remain, a challenge for mankind to overcome. Like the Tahitians, the Maori were also solid, experienced hagglers, and on many occasions they accepted a trade and then made a run for it before exchanging their own item. Tempers were often near boiling point, and Cook had his hands full restraining his sailors from shooting a double-crosser in the back as he paddled away. The crew found the New Zealand Maori much less inclined to the free love they found on Tahiti, but Cook became increasingly appalled at how casually warriors would trade their wives, daughters, and even young boys for a handful of iron nails, cloth, or trinkets. It was definitely time to leave. Having now completed the mapping of New Zealand, Cook was in a dilemma as how best to head home. He could turn southwest along the 50th parallel below New Holland and make straight for the Cape, but his supplies were critical, with no ports till Africa. The Endeavour was also starting to show the strain of over 18 months at sea. Sailing through the Southern Ocean at that latitude against the prevailing winds was known to be an extremely gruelling challenge, and despite his faith in the old bark, he felt the risk was too great to both ship and crew. So he made the prudent choice to sail across to New Holland and hug its coastline northwards, using the continental currents and more favourable weather to their advantage, cruising their way north towards the numerous Indonesian trading ports for some well-needed rest and repair, before heading towards the Cape via milder seas and currents. Cook would take the opportunity to chart this unknown eastern coast of modern Australia and, if suitable, claim it for Britain. Remember, the west, south, and most of the north of the continent had already been explored and claimed by the Dutch over a century before, so Cook was hardly discovering anything. By the end of April 1770, they sighted land at around the 40th parallel, and, turning north, made steady progress as Cook conscientiously filled out his charts with details of its rugged coast. He was keen to find a quiet bay with a suitable beach that could serve to haul the ship up and scrub its hull of barnacles, as well as replenish fresh supplies. Given the rugged and alien environment, Cook was keen to make contact with any natives and cultivate friendly relations in order to secure a source of supply and potential trade. Despite describing a number of campfires, they rarely saw more than a couple of individuals at any one time. And when they did, they were often in flimsy bark canoes that lacked any of the sophistication or ornamented construction of the Polynesian peoples they had seen so far. Eventually, they found both a quiet bay as well as the telltale campfires of a small community of Aboriginals. They looked substantially different to the Polynesians, being slim and dark, but most striking of all, they seemed entirely disinterested in both the ship and its crew. Any time they would approach a native, they would turn and run, disappearing into the bush. Cook reported on a number of occasions how amazed he was at the way these Aboriginals totally ignored their presence, barely even looking up at them, and unlike all the other natives they had come across on their journey, seemed to lack any curiosity about this massive canoe that dwarfed anything they could have possibly ever seen. It would be akin for us today to have a huge alien mothership drifting above our heads and not even bothering to look up at it. Supplies being extremely low, they had no choice but to row out and try and make contact. As they approached the shore, an older and younger Aboriginal confronted them on the beach and started yelling and waving their spear at them. Cook was now in a dilemma. Do they risk getting speared by coming ashore, or do they fire their rifles and scare the natives away? After some time and no headway being made, Cook had no choice but to have one of his Marines fire a musket, hoping it would frighten the natives away. When this failed, he felt there was no choice but to take a pistol loaded with birdshot and fire it at the feet of the older Aboriginal. The sting of the pellets had its intended effect, and the two ran off very quickly. And so the first white men in history came ashore on Botany Bay. As the next few days went by, Cook and his party continually tried to approach Aboriginals wherever they came across them, but as before, they abandoned their camps and ran away into the bush. It became clear to Cook after a while that they were never very far away, intently observing them, and that they could have speared him dozens of times. But it seems that the Aboriginals were themselves restrained, unwilling, for whatever reason, to kill these strange visitors, instead yelling and threatening, yet keeping their distance and not attacking. The captain frustratingly reported in his journal, after numerous failed attempts at diplomacy and gift-giving, that all they seemed to wish was for us to be gone. All attempts at negotiation having failed, and having restocked some fresh water from a local stream, the ship continued northwards, making its way past the Tropic of Capricorn. The number of islands and reefs became increasingly common, and Cook soon realised he was sailing into treacherous water, but he could never have been prepared for the extent of the Great Barrier Reef, the largest continuous living structure on Earth. Eventually, all their vigilance was in vain, and they ran aground on a reef in the middle of the night. It took all his skill and knowledge to manoeuvre the rowboats to place anchors and winch the ship off the rocks before it broke apart. Banks and the other officers had given themselves up for dead, but Cook rolled up his sleeves and, taking hold of the bilge pump, ordered all hands on deck to man them, gentlemen and sailors, together. Any other captain would have rather abandoned ship then degrade himself with manual labour. But not Cook. He was a common man and did what needed to be done to keep his crew calm and save their ship. Miraculously, they got her off the rocks and limped into a river estuary without the loss of even one man, where they careened the Endeavour on a beach and spent weeks repairing the damage. Here they finally made significant contact with local Aboriginals, and Cook reported that all their gifts of trinkets, cloth and tools were ignored, as in their previous encounters. Until one day when he offered them some fish, which was excitedly accepted. This brought out a number of others who came to exchange some of their own food with the crew. Within days, they were giving fire-making demonstrations and spear-throwing lessons to the crew, to everyone's great entertainment. With the ship nearly ready to sail, fresh provisions were stowed, and a couple of Aboriginals who had come on board suddenly became offended at the sight of the number of live turtles that were being captured as food for the ongoing voyage. They had no way of knowing why Cook needed so much food, and Cook had no way of knowing that the turtles were sacred to these people. Inevitable conflict arose, but Cook had the Endeavour heave to before any fatality occurred. Such misunderstandings seem to be the root cause of most human conflict. After a further number of near disasters on the reef, the Endeavour finally rounded the top end, where Cook charted the coasts and confirmed that a passage existed between New Guinea and New Holland. Cook dutifully, though half-heartedly, then claimed the territory in the name of the king, certain, however, that it would never warrant so much as an outpost, let alone a port or colony. Banks shared his view, yet was absolutely enthralled by the diversity of flora and fauna that was unique in all the world. Both Cook and Banks doubted that this huge land they had just mapped would hold any value to the Crown, with Banks describing it as largely barren and its bounties so few as to be a disaster for any crew who would have the misfortune of being shipwrecked there. If it were otherwise, surely the Dutch, Spanish, Arabs and others would have long settled it by now, as they did the Indonesian, Philippine and Malaysian islands just to the north. Nevertheless, despite the primitive canoes, housing and technology, both Cook and Banks reported their admiration for the self-sufficiency and simple needs of the Aboriginals, who, eking out the barest existence, seemed to have no interest in trade or interaction with foreigners, never attempting to steal from them, act mischievously, or prostitute their women and children for trifles and trinkets. They seemed entirely content in their isolation. As the Endeavour limped into Dutch Batavia, or modern Jakarta, for desperate repairs, Cook wrote a letter to be forwarded to England by a ship that was just leaving the harbour. In it he gave a brief account of his travels and was particularly satisfied to report that not one man aboard had been lost to scurvy or other illness. His regime of diet and hygiene was a huge triumph and would revolutionize sailing from that point forward. However, Batavia was a stinking tropical sewer of a port, and no sooner had Cook sent his letter than his men began to suffer from malaria. Banks, Solander and others also succumbed to raging fevers and debilitating illness. Desperate to leave, but with the ship not yet ready, sailor after sailor died, and by the time they finally shoved off, had lost 26 men with another 29 gravely ill before reaching the Cape in Africa. It seems that No diet and no amount of cleanliness could stave off the dreaded malaria. Despite the fact that a 40% crew death rate was unremarkable and acceptable for such long voyages, Cook was beside himself with despair. Despite being one of the few not to contract the disease, he himself began to suffer from stomach complaints, biliousness, and arthritis. 2 years and 11 months after setting out, the Endeavour finally limped back home. Banks, the dandy gentleman, received a hero's welcome, and his many ribald stories of exotic Tahitian maidens and high adventure made him an even bigger superstar than when he left. His collection of 35,000 specimens of plants and animals made him the preeminent biologist of his age. Cook, on the other hand, remained in relative obscurity, the commoner that he was, returning home to the devastating news that both his little princess, 4-year-old Elizabeth, and infant son Joseph, whom he had never set eyes upon, had died weeks after being born. In the year that passed, Banks was soon bored and looking for fresh adventures, so he pushed the Academy to finance another scientific trip. The Admiralty, encouraged by the improved scurvy outcomes of the first mission, had another few projects that needed testing, not least of which was a chronometer, a top-secret device that would allow timekeeping of such accuracy that longitude could be established with precision for the first time in history. If it worked, the Royal Navy would become a superpower. Despite Cook's demolishing the idea of an undiscovered southern landmass, belief in it persisted, and the Admiralty now proposed a new trip that would finally answer the question once and for all. Cook would be commissioned to circumnavigate the entire globe below the 60th parallel and descend as far south as possible, even below 70 degrees when he could. What was well known were the ferocious storms, waves, and icebergs that characterized these latitudes, and Cook was the only navigator at the time who was adequately qualified to undertake such a potentially treacherous journey. So, in 1772, preparations were underway for a new expedition. Given the robust success of the Endeavour, another 2 Whitby cats were purchased and fitted out for the voyage, with state-of-the-art azimuth compasses, ice anchors, high-tech fishing gear, cold weather clothing, and a water purification system that was capable of distilling salt as well as foul water into fresh drinking water. Banks, one of the key instigators of the voyage, was unhappy at having to work in another cramped collier, so he insisted on financing the building of extra decks to accommodate him in style, as well as to include an even larger entourage than the last time. More artists, more assistants, a disguised mistress, and even a French horn player for entertainment. The astute captain knew better than to argue or debate the arrogant gentleman, and stood quietly by while Banks poured another £10,000 into his floating party boat, knowing full well it would prove top-heavy and therefore unseaworthy. When compulsory Navy trials indeed condemned the ship as a crank, Cook was instructed to fix it, which basically entailed stripping the entire renovation back to the original fit-out. Banks was livid and walked out on the project. With the ship now seaworthy, Cook departed Plymouth on the Resolution, accompanied by the Adventure, skippered by Captain Thomas Furneaux, another highly competent commander, well respected by Cook. They wasted little time, sailing southeast to the Cape of Good Hope, and then headed south, crossing into the Antarctic Circle, the first navigator in history to do so. Afterwards, straight east, dipping below the 70th parallel, and well south of Australia, without so much as a whiff of land. Massive icebergs, waves, and fog posed a constant danger, and the ships became separated, eventually meeting up in New Zealand at a pre-designated rendezvous point chosen by Cook in case of just such an eventuality. The ships now set out scouring the entire Pacific in search of the elusive terra incognita, but instead discovered an extraordinary new series of islands, including modern Samoa, Tonga, New Caledonia, Norfolk Island, Vanuatu, as well as Easter Island. Having thoroughly crisscrossed the entire Pacific, and once again becoming separated, the adventure left the New Zealand rendezvous point alone and headed back to England. After resting the ship, Cook headed east once again, sailing around Cape Horn and the Magellan Straits, correctly predicting that the ice fields to their south were derived from an as yet unknown Antarctic landmass. Continuing east, he discovered South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands before making the decision to head for home, arriving in Portsmouth on the 30th of July 1775, after 3 years and 11 months at sea. This time, there was no one to steal his thunder, and Cook was publicly hailed as a hero. He was the man of the moment, and the Navy could do nothing other than promote him to the full rank of captain, giving him a generous pension and directorship of the Greenwich Naval Hospital, given his contribution to health and nutrition. But his honours didn't stop there. The Royal Society admitted him as a fellow. He was now, without question, a gentleman among equals, and a medal was subsequently minted in his honour for not losing a single man to illness in almost 4 years at sea, something that was so astonishing that British naval protocols, already having adopted his cartographic system, now adopted his diet and hygiene regimen as well. Cook had single-handedly improved the standard of British seafaring in a way that was to save countless lives in the future. The House of Lords declared him the first navigator in Europe, and the King was eventually to grant his family a coat of arms, the first step on the ladder of nobility. But for all these honours, his greatest joy was being home with his wife and now 3 boys, baby Hugh being born while he was away. By 1776, the Admiralty had solidified its grip on Canada, and discussions began about how best to service that region. Reports began to circulate of a fabled northwest passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans that would allow a ship to avoid having to sail around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America. Captain Cook, now an honoured guest at many a society dinner, was consulted as to the viability of an Arctic expedition, given his experience in both Newfoundland and the Antarctic. It was clear that they wanted him involved, and so Cook volunteered his services to king and country once again. But as the Resolution, his ship from the previous voyage, sailed out of Portsmouth once again, Cook was not the man he had once been. Decades at sea had taken their toll, and despite his clean living, rheumatism and an old gunshot wound to his right hand caused him constant pain. He was worn down, and ironically, his insistence on fresh food led to an increased risk of parasites and microbes that caused him long-term abdominal pain, as well as peculiar fits of rage from parasitic toxicity and vitamin deficiency. Where he once had a calm and boundless energy, he now began to feel increasingly restless and fatigued. The ship made its way south to the Cape and rode the strong westerly winds once again to New Zealand, discovering a couple of islands they missed in the fog the last time. They resupplied uneventfully in New Zealand and made their way north to discover Hawaii, which Cook named the Sandwich Islands after the First Lord of the Admiralty. Interactions with the natives were much the same as with other Polynesians, with the Hawaiians resembling them closely in culture, sexual freedom, and even in their language, despite the great distance that separated them. Pushing on, they reached the Californian coast, where Cook charted the entire unknown Northern American west coast for 3,500 miles, all the way north of Alaska, where they encountered unknown tribes and stayed with them for some time, engaging in trade and diplomacy. Eventually, the ships made their way into the Bering Strait, charting the Aleutian Islands and the Russian east coast. So great was his reputation that sea captains of the fledgling United States, now at war with Britain, were given express instructions not to molest or detain Cook's expedition, but to extend them every courtesy and assistance by no less than Benjamin Franklin, who referred to Cook as a giant of the age and an asset to all mankind. Pushing above the 70th parallel, the expedition eventually came up against an impenetrable wall of ice with no way around. Cook decided to chart the entire navigable coast of the Chukchi Sea before returning to Hawaii for the winter, to try again next season. But it was here that the clash of cultures finally caught up with him. Some reports claim that the Hawaiians were celebrating a religious festival for their god Lomo when Cook happened to sail into the bay. The superstitious Hawaiians conceived of him as the embodiment of their god and treated him and his crew with substantial deference. As the summer returned, the ships departed for their second attempt, but a mast was damaged in a freak storm, necessitating their prompt return to the island. The natives seemed confused at the unexpected return of their god, and their disposition changed considerably. Unsurprisingly, the usual thieving now intensified, with the natives stealing entire rowboats. Cook's usual response in such cases was to personally approach the king, apprehend him, and hold him hostage until the stolen goods were returned. But this time, as he approached the king, the locals, already agitated, began throwing stones, and Cook and his marines hastily retreated back to the shore. The frenzy intensified, and scores of warriors threw themselves upon the party, clubbing and then stabbing Cook and several marines to death before dismembering them. Cook's officers begged for the return of his corpse, with some reports suggesting that only a few body parts were ever returned to the crew, who buried them at sea. Such was the gruesome demise of a peace-loving man who took great pains to avoid bloodshed at every encounter during his entire career. The expedition continued on without him, but again failed to penetrate the ice, and so, after some assistance by Russian traders, they sailed back to England in October of 1780 to a subdued reception, as the Russians had already carried the news across land to London by January of that year. So stricken were his crew at his loss that ship's surgeon David Samwell noted in his journal, "He was beloved by his people, who looked upon him as a father, and obeyed his commands with alacrity. The confidence we placed in him was unremitting, our admiration of his great talents unbounded, our esteem for his good qualities affectionate and sincere." An obituary was printed in the London papers that read, "The untimely and ever to be lamented fate of so intrepid, so able, and so intelligent a sea officer may justly be considered as an irreparable loss to the public, as well as to his family, for in him were united every useful and amiable quality that could adorn his profession, nor was his singular modesty less conspicuous than his other virtues. His successful experiments to preserve the health of his crews are well known, and his discoveries will be an everlasting honour to his country." The devastating news broke Elizabeth's heart. Her husband would never see their youngest boy Hugh who, yet again, was born while his father was away. But her grief didn't end there. While she would go on to live to the ripe old age of 85, all three of her boys would die before her. The first two, tragically at sea, serving in the Royal Navy, and Hugh of fever while studying at Cambridge. In many ways, her Navy wife heroism in the birthing and raising of a family, alone and in constant fear for her husband's life, was itself heroic. For many years, they being not quite commoners and not quite gentlefolk, she found her station in life in a state of limbo, with little support from the Admiralty or a social network of similar position. And what of Cook's ultimate legacy? Can he be held responsible for the fate of Indigenous peoples across the Pacific in the wake of the colonial scramble that followed? While James Cook's discoveries were substantial and his charts and naval practices made seafaring far safer for eventual British expansion, the truth is that the Spanish, Dutch, French, Arab, Portuguese, and even Chinese presence in the Pacific preceded his by hundreds of years, and the exploitation of Indigenous people was already well underway by others by the time the British got there. Indeed, the British were just about the last European nation to get there, and, like the others, would probably not have even bothered with Australia and New Zealand had the war with America not robbed them of a dumping ground for their overflowing prisons back home. Cook, and for that matter, the genteel scientists of the Royal Society, could hardly have known that the government would eventually set up penal colonies there and seek to enslave or exterminate the local population. How could Niels Bohr have known that his study of subatomic particles would someday lead to Hiroshima? Or medieval alchemists looking for the elixir of life and stumbling upon the gas chlorine predict or condone its use as a weapon of mass destruction in war? Similarly, Cook was hardly blazing a solitary path of destruction, nor should he be held accountable for the abuses and very real genocide perpetrated by later generations of British settlers and soldiers. Like all great innovators, his discoveries had the potential to be used for good or evil. Moreover, one of the other myths that have persisted to now has been the romantic notion of the noble savage, where Indigenous peoples have long been depicted as living in a utopian peace and harmony with nature, rarely engaging in war or any of those practices we now view as dehumanizing. While Cook frequently recorded his concerns about the vulnerable future of these people in a rapidly shrinking world, his and other journals of the time are replete with reports of territorial warfare, headhunting and cannibalism. Tupaia, the exiled Tahitian holy man that accompanied them on the endeavour, was the sole survivor of an island clan that had been massacred to the last by their neighbours, and such reports of blood feuds, raids, slavery and massacres were commonplace and long-standing practice among native people, even in utopian Tahiti. History teaches us that one human trait is universal. Power-hungry leaders have always coveted their neighbours' territory, their women and their resources, whether by sword, spear, musket or nuclear warhead. James Cook, the quiet son of a farm labourer, was as underprivileged as it could get at the time. Perhaps because of this, he carried few, if any, of the prejudices of the educated and pompous European gentry that eventually made their way into the Pacific to preach and convert its inhabitants to their religion and way of life. Raised among the poor and the Quakers, he was, perhaps more than we are, keenly aware of the vulnerability of these people. He would no doubt be aggrieved and angered to see the misuse of his many gifts to inflict suffering on the people of the South Seas that he'd always dreamed of visiting. Ironically, this modest, introverted and humble man, who aspired only to become the best sailor he could be, would be embarrassed at the sheer number of statues and monuments erected around the world in his honour. It would do us well next time we come across one of his statues, rather than to accuse and vandalise, to instead pause and reflect on the staggering personal achievements that are possible by any one of us, Indigenous or not, privileged or not, when we apply ourselves with passion, dedication and resolve to be the best version of ourselves that we can possibly be, to care about the welfare of others and to strive for excellence in our chosen craft. In that way, black or white, Indigenous or not, James Cook the man can be a symbol worth keeping.